All right, so thanks so much for the invitation to be part of this interesting series of talks, and thanks a lot, Lisa and Natalie, for the introduction and for the setup. So this work represents a new direction for my research, one that my lab and I started just prior to the pandemic, and it's become a major focus for me as the pandemic gave me some time to think and reflect about what I really want to spend time on. So I'm really appreciative of this opportunity and genuinely curious for your thoughts and any connections to this work that you know of. All right, so what I'm interested in this research is interactions between people with aphasia and people in the general public who don't have aphasia and are unfamiliar with the person with aphasia that they're communicating with. So for example, if you imagine that Leah has non-fluent aphasia and she is traveling to visit family, she'll need to communicate with many strangers during her journey, including flight attendants, security personnel, maybe people she's sitting with. So given that Leah has non-fluent aphasia, this will almost definitely affect how unfamiliar conversation partners understand her and interact with her. Our question is, how does it affect these conversation partners if Leah discloses her aphasia to them? So the first thing to consider is that very people will know that Leah has aphasia without being told. And that's in part because relatively few people in the general public know what aphasia is. So about 7% of adults in the US can identify aphasia as a language disorder. And about a third of those people can do so through a personal connection because they know someone with aphasia. Internationally, public knowledge of aphasia varies, but we see generally low levels of basic knowledge, generally less than 20% across countries. So what's it like for people with aphasia when interacting with members of the general public? So according to interview studies that have looked at the lived experience of people with aphasia, low public knowledge of aphasia is a barrier to participation. People with aphasia also report that members of the general public display negative attitudes toward them, including impatience, an attitude of disrespect, an attitude that gives off the idea or the impression that they think the person with aphasia is unintelligent or not competent. Unfortunately, these experiences are also supported by experimental studies of listener perceptions of people with aphasia. So listeners rate people with aphasia lower than people without aphasia on measures of personality and intelligence. These negative attitudes are especially prevalent in listener perceptions of people with non-fluent aphasia. So that brings us back to aphasia self-disclosure, which is the act of communicating to a conversation partner that you have aphasia. So some people with aphasia report that self-disclosure can change these negative attitudes that are so troublesome. So for example, in a study by Howe and colleagues, a participant with aphasia said, "I say it, I've had a stroke, and it's amazing how it changes people to me. Then they have more patience." However, despite these kind of testimonials from people with aphasia, there's been little or possibly no experimental research on its effects in the context of aphasia. Because aphasia self-disclosure is a linguistic act, it can be challenging for people with aphasia. And therefore, some people use supported methods of self-disclosure. These include self-advocacy scripts that they may train in a clinical setting, as well as the use of aphasia ID cards. Now, in contrast with aphasia, there's been quite a lot of research on the impact of self-disclosure in the context of other communication disorders, particularly stuttering. A lot of this research has been speaker focused in that it focuses on the decision of whether or not to disclose, on the content of self-disclosure statements that people use, and in the relationship between self-disclosure and quality of life. More directly pertinent to our research are studies looking at the impact of self-disclosure on listeners' attitudes. In general, these studies show that listeners show more positive attitudes towards speakers who stutter, particularly better attitudes towards their personality and intelligence in the context of self-disclosure. And this research has also shown that the content and the timing of self-disclosure matters. In particular, there's a greater benefit from self-disclosure statements that are informational, that define stuttering and what the listener can expect, as opposed to self-disclosures that are more apologetic. So for example, with statements like bear with me or I'm sorry. Self-disclosure at the beginning of an interaction also seems to have a greater effect on attitudes than self-disclosure at the end of an interaction. And what this suggests is that the act of self-disclosure may shape the listener's attention and attitudes while they're listening. Now, stuttering differs from aphasia in many ways, but one of them is that most people have heard of stuttering. So self-disclosure occurs in the context of this background knowledge. What happens in disorders like aphasia that are not well known in the general public? 2 studies have examined this in the context of voice disorders, such as spasmodic dysphonia, which are not well known. One study showed that disclosure of a diagnostic label, so saying that a speaker has a voice disorder called spasmodic dysphonia, improved perceptions of the speaker's friendliness. However, 2 studies showed that detailed educational materials about voice disorders didn't impact listener attitudes towards the speaker significantly. This suggests that there may be something really meaningful and important for listeners simply to know the basic reason why someone isn't communicating the way they might expect. There may be also something important in the act of self-disclosure itself in terms of forming a social connection between the speaker and the listener. So that brings us to our research question. So how does self-disclosure of aphasia affect unfamiliar conversation partners? We're focusing on these conversation partners as listeners, mostly in this work, so we'll be calling them listeners in this talk. And we're particularly interested in supported means of self-disclosure, like aphasia ID cards and self-advocacy scripts, because these are all often part of SLP services and counseling, and they're in need of an evidence base. So first, we're interested in the effects of self-disclosure on attitudes. This includes the listener's experience, such as their level of patience and comfort while listening to the speaker, as well as their attitudes towards the speaker's intelligence and personality. Second, we're interested in the adaptation of linguistic expectations to people with aphasia. So adjusting the language processing system to atypical language input. We want to know whether aphasia self-disclosure can shape this adaptation process. Finally, we're interested in communicative behaviors. These include the willingness to engage with the speaker and the likelihood of using conversational behaviors that facilitate communication. So with me being a psycholinguist by training and affinity, we started here when looking at this research, looking at adaptation of linguistic expectations. But in our work in progress, we're designing experiments looking at attitudes and communicative behaviors as well. So in the rest of this talk, I'm going to be summarizing the literature on what we know about adaptation to atypical language patterns. I'll be presenting the results of an eye tracking experiment, which examined the impact of aphasia ID cards on listeners' adaptation to aphasic language. And finally, I'll be briefly discussing some future directions. Okay, so we're going to move now to adaptation to atypical language patterns. So how might the language system of non-aphasic listeners adapt to the language produced by people with aphasia? Again, there's little or possibly not any previous research on this topic. Of course, if there is, I would love to hear about it. However, there's some evidence from adaptation to other forms of what we might call non-normative language, including language produced by non-native speakers and speakers with other real or simulated communication disorders. So this literature has shown that there are at least 2 forms of adaptation that we're going to talk about today. The first is when the listener adjusts their expectation to the reduced linguistic competence of the speaker. So these are adjustments that the listener makes whenever they know or expect that the speaker will have difficulty with language. These are general adjustments that are not specific to what the speaker actually says. The second is learning of speaker-specific language patterns and language error patterns. So these are actually learning the pattern of language that the person produces. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about adaptation to reduced linguistic competence. So what does that consist of? The way that I'm seeing the literature, I think there's 2 main processes. And the first one is that listeners tend to expect to repair and to accommodate errors when they're coming from someone that they expect to have difficulty with language. Now, most of the relevant literature that I've cited here is on listening to non-native speakers. So with non-native speakers, comprehenders tend to expect errors. So this means when the speaker produces a grammatical error, they tend to find it less surprising. This has been shown primarily in ERP studies. Comprehenders tend to repair errors when they encounter them. So when a non-native speaker produces a sentence that's ambiguous between containing a grammatical error or meaning something implausible, the listener has a tendency to repair that grammatical error so that the meaning is something plausible. Third, listeners tend to accommodate errors. So let's say that the speaker omits a piece of linguistic information. The listener has a tendency to assume that this was due to their linguistic difficulty and not due to them, for example, directly trying to actually conceal something. So I think the thing to emphasize here is that these adaptations are probably good. If you're listening to a speaker with aphasia, it's probably better to be relatively unsurprised by errors, to be ready to implicitly correct them and repair them, and to be willing to assume that the speaker has good intentions in communicating. Okay, this is the second aspect of adaptation to reduce linguistic competence, and that is letting go of assumptions about what is going to be hard for the speaker to produce. The relevant literature here comes mostly from eye tracking research looking at the processing of disfluencies. So disfluencies, such as can signal language production difficulty. When a neurotypical native speaker produces a disfluency, listeners expect that the upcoming linguistic material will be something relatively hard. For example, a unfamiliar word or a complex syntactic structure. But there's a reduced tendency to predict hard material after a disfluency when listening to a speaker that either has or is expected to have reduced linguistic competence. So this has been shown in studies of listening to non-native speakers, as well as one study in which listeners comprehended language produced by a speaker who had simulated object agnosia. So the idea here is that the listener is no longer assuming that a disfluency signals a hard linguistic material. The speaker may have difficulty even with the things that are relatively less complex. Okay. So moving on to learning atypical speaker-specific language patterns. There are multiple studies that show that speakers learn patterns of errors or atypical language use. These studies have looked at varying levels of linguistic structure, including lexical production patterns, distributions of disfluencies, syntactic error patterns, and the use of both underinformative and overinformative referential expressions. Now, in terms of the speakers in these studies, there has been a mix of studies that included non-native speakers. There's one study by Grodner and Sedevy in which the speaker had an impairment that caused language and social problems, which wasn't otherwise specified. And in some of these studies, atypical patterns are simply presented to listeners without giving any explanation of why the person might be having language difficulty. But in all these studies, there were fairly robust learning processes. All right, so in addition to the few studies that I've mentioned that have looked at adaptation to speakers with language or communication disorders, there are a few studies that have examined linguistic adaptation to speakers who stutter. So I'll cover that literature here. So when listening to a speaker who stutters, listeners are more likely to attribute disfluencies to speech versus language difficulty. And this is quite rational because the disfluency produced by someone who stutters might reflect a problem with fluency versus language. But interestingly, listeners also tend to be more cautious in making syntactic predictions. So it's been suggested that listeners are less able to build a good model of what is coming next when they're listening to a speaker who stutters. So they're going to be more cautious in making predictions. Now, Leonard and colleagues did the only study that we know of that examined the impact of disclosing a communication disorder on the listener's language processing. So they had two groups of participants listen to a speaker who stuttered, and they told one group that the speaker stuttered and did not tell the other group. In this study, the authors found no effect of disclosing stuttering on processing of disfluencies. And they offered the possible explanation that disclosure of stuttering was superfluous because listeners could probably already tell that the speaker stuttered. If we shift this back towards aphasia, we think it's not very likely that disclosure of aphasia would be superfluous since so few people even know what aphasia is. And also disclosure that someone has a language disorder might be more likely to affect linguistic adaptation than disclosure of stuttering. So what do these processes of adaptation require in terms of cognitive resources? There's been a little bit of research that's looked at this as well. The first is that it simply requires more. Cognitive demands are increased. So it's been shown that processing non-normative speech, this includes speech from speakers with non-native accents, as well as those with speech disorders, increases listening effort. And this is probably also true for atypical language. Plus, of course, many people have both language and speech disorders. Second, adaptation seems to require reallocation of cognitive resources. In one study looking at processing of language produced by non-native speakers, Lev Ari found that when listening to non-native speakers, listeners shift their attention to context versus linguistic input. So this is a reallocation of attention that reflects an adaptation process. This shift occurs only in listeners with high working memory. So this suggests that individual cognitive resources likely play a role in these adaptation processes. So going back to our research questions, how might aphasia self-disclosure impact linguistic adaptation to a speaker with aphasia? So the first aspect of adaptation that we've discussed is adaptation to reduce linguistic competence. Do we expect this to be affected by aphasia self-disclosure? So yes, we do. Because aphasia self-disclosure directly informs the listener that the speaker is likely to have difficulty with language, we think that it will facilitate these adaptation processes. The second aspect of adaptation we talked about is learning speaker-specific language patterns. Here, it's less clear, to me at least, whether we would expect this to be affected by aphasia self-disclosure. It could possibly be affected if it's affected via changes in allocation of cognitive resources. So for example, if self-disclosure encourages increased allocation of attention to task, it could also facilitate learning speaker-specific language patterns. And so that brings us to the experiment that I'm going to tell you about, which looked at the impact of aphasia ID cards on listeners' adaptation to aphasic language. So this is work that I have done with Colleen Ward, who started this work as her undergraduate honors thesis. She graduated in 2020, and we've continued to work on this work during her master's thesis. So our specific questions in this experiment were does presentation of aphasia ID card prior to listening to a speaker with aphasia facilitate adaptation to reduce linguistic competence? We looked specifically at whether the aphasia ID card encouraged the listener to expect errors. Second, does the ID card impact learning of language error patterns? So our participants in this study were 27 young adults, mostly women. They were native English speakers with no history of speech or language impairment and self-reported normal or corrected vision and hearing. This is fewer than we planned. The study, like many, was paused due to COVID, and then we decided to treat these as pilot or preliminary data and start to plan new studies. So most of our participants were undergraduate students in communication disorders in their second or third year of study. They had a mean of 5.6 completed or in progress courses in our department. So a major caveat here is that this sample is not representative of the general population in many ways, demographically, but also in terms of their likely higher knowledge of aphasia. In addition, some may not have been naive to the study purpose because they may know that I work on aphasia, they may know Colleen. So that's something to keep in mind when we look at the results. So these participants were randomly assigned to a card group or a no card group. The card group was shown an Aphasia ID card, and the no card group was not. So this is the Aphasia ID card that we used. It simulated an aphasia self-disclosure from our speaker in the experiment. So this card included key elements of many ID cards, as well as self-advocacy statements. It included a definition of aphasia. So aphasia means I have trouble understanding you, reading, writing, and speaking. It includes a statement about intact intelligence. So I am intelligent, but need some help with language. And it includes a couple of recommended communication strategies, in particular ones that encourage patience. So speak slower with simpler language and give me a minute to respond. Now, the task that our participants did was a word picture matching task. The linguistic stimuli were simple sentences like click on the apple, and they were recorded by a male speaker with non-fluent aphasia. So the recordings were accurate and intelligible, but they included natural disfluencies, including distorted segments, long pauses, and a short speech rate that we did not manipulate in any way in our stimuli. While listening, participants viewed pairs of object pictures. Half of the pairs contained semantically related pictures, like an apple and banana. They were all categorically or taxonomically related, and half contained unrelated pictures, like this prince and duck. So this is a description of the experimental design. At the beginning of the experiment, all participants were told that the stimuli were recorded during a previous experiment. The groups were randomized, and then all participants began the experiment. There were 2 blocks of our word picture matching task at the beginning and at the end of the experiment. Each consisted of 10 trials with semantically related items and 10 with unrelated items. During these 2 blocks, eye tracking and response data were collected. In between blocks, participants completed what we called an error observation block. They were told that they were observing the speaker when he was making the recordings and to just look and listen. During that block, they were shown a single picture in each trial, supposedly the same one the speaker had seen, and they heard him produce a sentence. There were 8 trials with semantic categorical errors. So like this one where they were shown a necklace and the sentence that the speaker said was click on the bracelet. And there were 12 correct sentences as well. We were interested in whether language processing was initially different between the 2 groups, so in this first block, as well as whether the effects of error observation differed across the 2 groups. Okay, so moving on to our eye tracking data collection and measures. So participants' right eye was tracked at 1,000 hertz, and the data were aggregated into 20 millisecond bins. We computed 2 measures for each bin, which we call target advantage and workspace advantage. These are both binary variables. Target advantage is kind of a standard eye tracking measure, and it measures the degree to which attention is differentially allocated to the target, so the apple in this picture, as opposed to the distractor. So in the target advantage data, a bin was giving a score of 1 if more than half of the samples were fixations on the target, and 0 if more than half were fixations on the distractor. So workspace advantage is a less common measure, and it reflects the overall visual attention to task. So here, bins were given a score of 1 if more than half of the samples were fixations on either picture, and 0 if more than half were a fixation elsewhere, so elsewhere on the screen. Our critical time window started with the onset of the noun, so for example, apple, and ended at the earliest trial end, which was 3,300 milliseconds later. We analyzed the eye tracking data using generalized additive mixed models, or GAMs. GAMs allow us to compute smooth curves whose shape is non-linear and data-driven. An advantage of this is that we can analyze relatively long time windows, like the 3.3 second window we were interested in, without splitting it into smaller windows, which can introduce bias if you do it arbitrarily. So here are smooth curves generated for one of our measures. On the x-axis is time in seconds from noun onset, and on the y-axis is the dependent measure, which is workspace advantage in this case. The blue and red lines represent the estimated smooth curves for 2 conditions, And again, the shape of these curves is totally built on the basis of the data. We don't give it any information about the shape. We then subtract the two smooth curves to create difference curves. So this is a difference curve for the two conditions that are shown above, different scale. And to compute the parts of the curve that significantly differed between these two, we determine the 95% confidence intervals of the difference curve, and that is the part that we consider to significantly differ. Okay, so from now on, I'm not going to be showing you smooth curves, but rather the actual eye tracking data, which is a bit noisier. Okay, so moving on to hypotheses and results for this experiment. So our first hypothesis was that aphasia self-disclosure would encourage the listener to expect errors. We tried to answer this question by comparing the two groups within the pre-observation block before they had observed the speaker making any errors. We predicted that the effect of self-disclosure would be that there would be lower target advantage in the card group. Because if this group is expecting errors, they're going to be more likely to look at the distractor picture. Okay, so here are the results comparing the card to the no card group in the pre-observation block. The target advantage data are on the left and the workspace advantage data are on the right. Again, time is on the x-axis and target and workspace advantage are plotted on the proportional scale on the y-axis. The card group is in black and the no card group is in gray. So we did not find any interactions between relatedness and other variables. So the data are collapsed across relatedness in actually all of the figures that I'm going to be showing you. However, we did see differences between groups in this block. For target advantage, you can see that towards the end of the trial, there's a trend for the target advantage to be greater in the card group than in the no card group, and it reaches significance in this window here. In contrast, there were no significant effects of group on the workspace advantage data. So comparing what we had hypothesized to what we found, so we had expected to see lower target advantage in the card group. We did not find that. Instead, we actually found that the card group had a greater target advantage towards trial end. Well, however, we wouldn't want to rule out the possibility that aphasia self-disclosure does cause listeners to expect errors just on these preliminary data. We need more research with larger sample size and with different paradigms to figure that out. Sorry, so why did target advantage remain higher in the card group? So the pattern that we basically saw, if you look at it, is a faster drop-off in target advantage for the no card group, which is in gray here, versus the card group, which is in black. When looking through the literature, we found an interesting parallel with a study conducted by Lauder and colleagues looking at the processing of stuttered speech. They found a late drop-off in target advantage using a very similar measure to us for stuttered speech as compared to non-stuttered speech. And their suggestion was that listeners might have been impatient with or distracted by stuttered speech, which caused them to sustain visual attention less. So one possible explanation of our data, which needs further investigation, is that aphasia ID cards may have contributed to sustained attention or more generally, greater patience in the people that had seen these cards. Okay, so our second hypothesis was that aphasia self-disclosure would facilitate learning of error patterns. So what we did to try to answer this question was to compare the post to pre observation data within the card group and within the no card group. Ideally, you'd want to have all of these groups in one model. But if we had done that, it would have been too complex for the data set that we had in terms of fitting the models. So we looked at the two groups separately in this analysis. So for the card group, the predicted effect of self-disclosure was that we would see evidence of learning. And this would show up as a relative decrease in target advantage for related items. So if listeners are learning the speaker's error pattern, and the pattern is that he produces categorical errors, then over time, they should start to look more at the distractor, which is going to be a reduction in target advantage if they've learned this pattern. In contrast, in the card group, we expected to see either weaker evidence or no evidence of learning. Okay, so we'll move on to the results again. Starting with the card group, comparing the pre to post observation data. Target advantage is still on the left and workspace advantage is on the right. But now black is the post observation data and gray is the pre-observation data. Okay, so the first thing, which was a little disappointing for us, is that we didn't see statistically significant evidence of error pattern learning, which would have shown up as a relatedness by block interaction. So because of that, we've again collapsed the data across relatedness conditions. We think that this may be just because our participant and item numbers were underpowered to detect an interaction. So we also looked at overall effects of block within the card group. So looking at the target advantage, there were no significant effects of block from pre to post observation. But in the workspace advantage, you can see that throughout the trial, the workspace advantage is numerically larger post observation as compared to pre-observation, and it is significant in about the first 800 milliseconds of the trial. So now we can look at the post versus pre-observation data for the no card group. Again, we did not see significant evidence of error pattern learning, and so we've collapsed the data. So looking at the target advantage data, which is again is on the left, we found that for most of the post-response period, the target advantage was greater pre-observation than post-observation. And so in other words, it went down in the post-observation block. For workspace advantage, we saw a pattern that is complex when you just look at these pairwise comparisons. But if you look at the shape of the curves, what you can see is that the target advantage is falling more quickly in the post-observation block. So it's higher here, but lower here. But then it rises again so that it is higher than in the pre-observation block within this window towards the end of the trial. So we're figuring out what we think this might mean, but the combination of this pattern of a reduced target advantage and this pattern of an increased target advantage towards the end of the trial is consistent with the idea that listeners may have been second guessing their response. So after they initially responded, they may have thought, well, actually, maybe that was an error. And they looked back to the distractor, which would increase their looks both to the distractor as well as their looks overall to the pictures. Okay, so we're going to compare hypothesis 2 to our results. Again, our results did not match our prediction because we didn't see clear evidence of learning in either group. Again, we'd like to try this again with a more strongly powered study to see if we can get that evidence of learning. But we did see changes from pre to post observation in each group. So in the card group, we saw increased workspace advantage from pre to post. And in the card group, we saw this complex pattern involving both target and workspace advantage at trial end that might reflect second guessing. So what have we learned from these preliminary data? Well, the first thing we learned is that we need more research. So future research is needed to determine whether aphasia self-disclosure impacts expectation of errors and learning of error patterns. But we do feel like we did learn some things from these data. In particular, aphasia self-disclosure may shift allocation of attention. We saw that presentation of an aphasia ID card may allow listeners or encourage listeners to sustain their visual attention to the target. We saw this by comparing the card to the no card group in the pre-observation data. In addition, it may allow or encourage listeners to increase their visual attention to task after errors are observed. Okay. So briefly, I'll just talk about a couple of future directions for this work. In future research, we're interested in studying adaptation to aphasic language with a couple of elements that we didn't include in the present study. So this is a big one. Larger samples of naive participants that are demographically representative of the general population. So again, in the study I just presented to you, we had communication disorders undergraduates. So we'd really want to see what the effects of this type of manipulation is on people who are less likely to know about aphasia or to have a particular interest in communication disorders. It'll be important to examine the effects of aphasia self-disclosure using multiple speakers with varying aphasia profiles. So the speaker that recorded our stimuli has moderate non-fluent aphasia. It would be interesting to see what the effects of self-disclosure are on with a speaker with milder aphasia, where the aphasia is less detectable, as well as in a speaker with a more severe aphasia. We think that this research will require looking at multiple aspects of adaptation. So we've talked about a couple of different types of adaptation in this study, as well as using complementary methods and paradigms. So eye tracking, for example, along with ERP. And finally, we're interested in examining the effects of modality and content of self-disclosure statements on adaptation. So by modality, we mean, for example, comparing aided modes of self-disclosure, like aphasia ID cards, to verbal modes of self-disclosure, like self-advocacy scripts. And by content, we mean what are the independent effects of those key elements that we talked about. So in the aphasia ID card that we presented in this study, we included kind of everything, a definition of aphasia, a statement about intelligence, communication strategies, but which of these are really doing the work in shifting adaptation processes in listeners. And in addition, we're interested in looking at the impact of aphasia self-disclosure on listener attitudes and behaviors, and ultimately understanding how attitudes might impact adaptation processes and vice versa. Okay, so what can be gained by this work? To me, there are two main things that can be gained. The first is an understanding of typical adaptation processes to speakers with aphasia. It can be really useful, I think, to understand what the experience of listeners is when they listen to an unfamiliar speaker with aphasia, and to start to learn how these processes can, and maybe in some cases can't, be shaped by brief interventions like aphasia self-disclosure, as well as more generally by aphasia awareness campaigns. This research can also be the starting point for understanding how people with aphasia respond to non-normative language input. So for example, presumably these processes have to take place when two people with aphasia communicate with each other, for example, in the context of a support group. Second, we think that one thing we can gain from this research is an evidence base for the most effective use of supported aphasia self-disclosure methods, such as advocacy scripts and ID cards, to be able to show how modulating the specifics of how self-disclosure takes place impacts adaptation processes and attitudes and behaviors. Okay, so that is it. Thank you very much for listening. And I encourage anyone who wants to contact me about this work. I wanted to just briefly thank Colleen and the rest of our lab. I wanted to thank the speaker who recorded the stimuli, as well as our research participants. I wanted to thank my colleagues who have helped support my research productivity and or giving me some feedback on this work as I've been developing it, as well as our funding sources at UMass and at ASHA. All right, thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to discuss this in questions.
Wonderful talk. Thank you, Dr. Mack. We have a couple of questions in the chat box. And for those of you who haven't had a chance to submit theirs, please feel free to go ahead and do that now as we address the earlier questions. So first, a note from Thomas Broussard. I don't know if you can see the chat, but I'll read it out to you. So he says, yes, I started using my ID card almost from the beginning. And then as soon as I got better, I realized that using the ID card is helpful for me, as well as the wider public who didn't know anything about aphasia. I also started with some more strategies, and he says, in one article of mine called Enriched Therapy, publicly proclaiming our errors can be highly therapeutic. And he gives us resources to look into that, is one that he would recommend for us to look at. I asked a question earlier on. I'm curious about the participants who were giving the self-disclosure cards. Can you give us some more information about their stage in recovery? You know, for those that may be a little bit more in the acute stage, you know, might not have those strategies or other compensatory strategies that they could use compared to more chronic stroke survivors.
You mean in the context of the experiment, or in the context more generally of of the use of self-disclosure
Yeah,
resources?
I guess in the experiment, so I'm curious
Okay,
if
yeah.
they were allowed to use their own kind of thing, their own kind of strategies on top of the card, or was it very much, you will provide the card and that's kind of the extent?
Okay, so in the experiment, so all of our subjects were young adults without aphasia.
Okay.
Just students, yeah. So students enrolled in communication disorders classes. So they were, neurotypical young adults. And so the people in the card group were shown that one specific self-disclosure card that we constructed. It wasn't constructed by our speaker with aphasia. We generated a pseudonym for the speaker and just used this online template for creating a card.
Okay, perfect. Here is another question. We have, thank you for the talk. Could sustained attention effects be task specific? Maybe participants were trying to get it right in a way that they might not be, or might not in a naturalistic conversation, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sustained attention task, meaning like the longer maintenance of visual attention on the target. Yes, that could be task specific. I think that that's something we really would need to look at. I think what we wanted to do next in this line of research is to relate these online changes to listeners' self-reports of their attitudes, so we at least will be able to know whether, if we have a pattern that we think reflects greater attention, whether the listener actually feels like they're more attentive or less distracted, and that might be more likely to generalize to what they would actually do with the speaker. But that's still a few steps away, a few steps removed from what's happening in a naturalistic conversation. It would be great to get to there at some point. So thank you for that question. I also wanted to respond to Tom Broussard, just to thank you for that comment, and that I will check out that reference. I think that, in terms of research, there's some really interesting research on stuttering that interviews people who stutter to get an idea of when they self-disclose and what it does for them, and what it really does for them. How does it contribute to their sense of security in the interaction? And I think that we need that research for aphasia, but I don't think we have it yet. So I think that would be really important to do, to get the perspectives of people with aphasia.
And then last, we have, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if you tried something similar in a more naturalistic conversation with individuals with aphasia. We wondered how the results might differ in back and forth conversation, for example.
Yeah, so that is a great question. And I think that that's kind of ultimately where this work needs to end up. Ideally I think there's some aspects of processing that need a little bit more of an experimental setup, but that we can ultimately get it back to a conversational setup. I mean, I think one idea that I've been thinking about and have not done or even really seriously started to plan yet is the idea of hiring an actor with aphasia to have a series of conversations with participants, with the idea being that if you have an actor in principle, you'd be able to have some degree of control over what happens in the interaction, as opposed to if it's just new people being paired in each context. So yes, I think that would be great. As a little bit of a step towards reality, a little step towards reality. One of the next studies that we're planning it's still one-sided in the sense that there's just participants and they are listening to language from people with aphasia, but then they're asked to simulate how they would interact with the speaker in a simulated social context. So the context that we chose is when they're sitting on a plane next to the speaker, and then we give them a series of questions about what they might be likely to do or not do. So that's kind of starting, it's not quite reality, but it's starting to push towards reality. And we want to be able to link this stuff about real conversation and interaction to these things about processes that are a little more under the hood, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. All right, it doesn't look like we have any more questions in the chat. So I want to take a second and just thank you for this wonderful talk. We really enjoyed listening from you and hearing about your work. And everybody stay tuned for our next talk in October. Thank you very much, Dr. Mack.
Great. Thanks so much, everybody, for coming in for your comments. Nice to meet some of you and see some of you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.